Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Reclamation Project, where we believe in no soul left behind. So, we're here to provide a platform for both believers and non believers to ask tough questions, even when they're controversial, seemingly blasphemous, or otherwise offensive. It is our mission to give answers that are rooted in science and evidence where at all possible, but most certainly objective ones that aren't based or depend on our feelings. At the end of the day, it's our hope that you'll achieve a better understanding of God, which we know improves your perception, hence also your impression of Him. After all, understanding is a difference maker and a deal breaker. And well, if you're already a believer, welcome to the opportunity of perhaps relearning some things of the Bible. So we thank you, and we're just happy that you've joined us today. We've all heard the saying, "You are what you eat." Ever consider that you are what you think? If we look back on just the last 5 decisions, whether good or bad, and that thought process that went along with it, don't they actually tell us who we are? And how can we ever forget what was going on inside our head just before we made that last bad decision? Something that makes you say, Still not convinced? Well, today Professor Michael Buffington is back with us, and he is going to present on the importance of guarding your thoughts. Welcome back, Professor. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Brother Stan. Always a pleasure to be here with the Reclamation Project.
Looking forward.
All right. How's it going, folks? Good to be back. As Brother Stanley said, today we will be talking about guarding your mind and your thoughts. Now, this is such a profound and such a deeply layered topic that we're going to be doing multiple parts to this. So, what we're talking about today will just be sort of the tip of the iceberg. But I wanted to go to the Bible very quickly because, very interestingly, the Bible has some interesting thoughts about what to do in regards to our minds and guarding our minds. And let's see if that lines up with what the science and the psychology says current day. So in First Peter chapter 1, verse 13, he says, "Wherefore, gird up the loins of your mind and be sober." So he's telling us that we have to guard our minds, shield our minds. We have to put armor plating around our minds. In other words, we have to protect our minds, right? And when he says be sober, well, when you are sober minded, that means you are on your toes, you are agile, you are aware, you are cognizant of what's going on around you. So, what he's doing is he's giving us some very sound advice, whether you are a Christian or a non-Christian, a believer or a non-believer, a secularist or somebody who believes in divine power. How can you argue that piece of advice? It's a great piece of advice. As a matter of fact, in the book of Philippians, chapter 4, verses 6 through 8, Paul gives us this very interesting counsel. Okay, he says, "Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ." So what is he saying here? Many of us who have been in churches, right? If you have been in churches, you are very familiar with that passage. The problem that comes from familiarity with certain passages in the Bible is that they tend to become sort of cliche. But the Bible is never a cliche. If you really dig, there's something deeper there. What he's saying is, don't worry. Instead of worrying, live a life full of gratitude and give all your problems to God. And then he says, as a result of foregoing and jettisoning worry and giving your problems to God and living a life filled with gratitude, you'll have a peace that passes all understanding, a peace that most people will not understand or comprehend. Now, even if you are somebody who is a non-believer or struggling in your faith or whatever, you can apply that very succinctly, because if you live a life of gratitude, in a state of gratitude for all that you have, it's going to be very hard to focus on the negative. It's going to be very hard to focus on the things that you don't have. And as a result, again, whether you are a Christian, a secularist, or anything in between, you're going to have a sense of peace that most people don't understand. You know, a lot of times when we see people who have peace, even in the midst of problems and difficulties, you know, we say, how does that person get that peace? How does that person, be able to stay calm in these type of situations? And it's because they found some secret sauce that many of us, I would say the vast majority of us, are not aware of, right? And in this particular passage that I just read to you, I read it to you because um Paul is about to say something subsequent to that is also very interesting. He says, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. So, what is Paul doing? Paul is essentially becoming a therapist at this moment. And what he is doing is he is encouraging us to do something called cognitive behavioral therapy, or cognitive reframing. Okay. He's saying, rather than focus on the difficulties, rather than focus on the trials and the tribulation and the negativity of life, rather than hone in on the disappointments of life, he said, why don't you focus on the good things instead? We all understand that there are bad things that happen or maybe currently happening in life, right? But what the therapist Paul, Dr. Paul, is saying here is he's saying, if you instead focus your mind on whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue in these things, if there be any praise, think on these things. He's saying, keep your mind focused on the positive. Keep your mind focused on the good, on the blessings, on the things that you should be grateful for, because there are always going to be, weeds that grow in the grass, and thorns here and there, and there's always going to be dark spots in life. But guess what? There's flowers too. Guess what? There's sunshine too, right? The storm doesn't last forever. Even Noah, the storm stopped after 40 days, right? So what we have to understand is that what Paul is doing here is he's essentially giving us counsel to become positive thinkers, right? So one way to guard your mind is becoming a positive thinker. Cognitive reframing, in other words, taking the negativity and focusing on the positive. In every negative situation that we may encounter, there's going to be some sort of positive that we can take out of it. However small there may be, there's going to be something positive. It could be a little sliver, but there will be something positive. There will be some lesson learned, some personal growth, some sort of spiritual growth. There will be something positive after every challenge, after every trial. And there's a reason why these trials come into our lives, because they make us stronger mentally and otherwise. I like to go to the gym. And I know that when I get down to do push-ups or whatever it is that I'm going to do, it is not always going to feel good, right? Maybe the first few, but boy, once you get to that last few in that set, it starts to hurt. It starts to burn. Well, guess what? Growth doesn't happen when you're comfortable. You have to push yourself. You have to challenge yourself. Your muscles have to experience challenges in order to grow. In the same way, emotionally and spiritually, we have to experience challenges in life, and we have to handle them well in order to grow. That's the key. See, just the challenge itself is not going to help us grow, but how we respond to the challenge is how we help ourselves grow. Going back to my analogy of the push-ups, if the minute I started to feel some sort of resistance or difficulty, I quit, my muscles would never grow. They would never have to grow because I would stop short of pushing them beyond my comfort zone. But if I keep going, they will grow. And it's the same thing. Now, some of you may say, okay, well, that's fine. I hear you, but maybe that's just a bunch of Bible mumbo jumbo, right? Because, Paul didn't have to deal with my particular illness. Now, since we're zeroing in on Paul for a little bit, I'm going to go back to the Bible. And I'm just going to, just for the sake of showing you some of the things that he went through, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7 through 10, Paul talks about something very interesting, right? You say, Paul didn't have my illness. He didn't have my physical ailment. But Paul talks about something very interesting in that particular passage. Here's what he says. He says, and lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of revelation, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me. In other words, he had a physical malady. He had some sort of physical weakness. He had some sort of serious physical problem that he referred to as a thorn in the flesh. It was such a problem. It was so difficult to deal with and so hindering that he referred to it as a thorn in the flesh. And look at how he looks at it. He doesn't say, woe is me, my life was horrible, things were made so much more difficult because of this thorn in the flesh. He doesn't say, I don't understand why this isn't fair. He didn't say any of those things. Look at how he reframed that situation. He said I was given a thorn, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh. And interestingly enough, Bible scholars believe that Paul had very poor eyesight. And back in the days, you couldn't just go to lens crafters and strengthen your prescription, right? This was a different time altogether. But they believe he had very poor eyesight. And he said, there was a thorn in the flesh given to me, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. So the way he looked at this difficult situation was, I'm going through this very difficult thing, but I think I understand. I have a tendency to become proud, right? I have a tendency to maybe become a little haughty or arrogant or something to that effect. And this is to keep me humble, right? This is to keep me humble, lest I should be exalted above measure, right? I always know that I have to depend on others to help me. I have to depend on God ultimately to help me. So I get it. I understand. So why was he not upset? Why was he not depressed over his thorn in the flesh? Why was he not, full of anxiety and anger and frustration? Because he reframed that whole situation and he thought about it differently altogether. And he goes on and he says that he asked the Lord essentially 3 times to take it away from him. And God said, no, my strength is good enough. My strength is sufficient for thee. Now, what did he say? Did he say, that's not fair, God? That is really unfair. Okay. I'm doing all this work for you. I'm going all over Asia Minor, experience all these difficulties, and you can't just do this little thing for me? Come on. Is that what he said? No, he didn't. He actually said something very interesting. In verse 10, he says, therefore I take pleasure in my infirmities, in reproaches and necessities and persecutions, and in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So what he did was he cognitively reframed that whole situation with the thorn in the flesh, and he was able to sidestep depression, anxiety, anger, frustration, and all of those things. So how did Paul guard his mind? He guarded his mind by reframing that whole situation. But you say, well, okay, that's fine. But my life really, really sucks. My life stinks. It's terrible. It's been difficult from pillar to post. There's been no sort of rest, no island of rest in between. It's just been just tossed to and fro on the ocean of life. And life has not been kind. Nothing I ever want happens. And guess what? If Paul were here, he would probably look at my life and be like, oh, yes, I get it. But you know what? Paul, Mr. Therapist Paul, who said, that we could just reframe our thoughts and think on good things and focus on positive things and be happier and have a peace that would pass all understanding, that most people wouldn't even be able to comprehend. This same Paul didn't have an easy life either. As a matter of fact, in that same book, Second Corinthians, in the previous chapter, he kind of lays out his life and lays out some of the things that he went through. So, again, for those of you who are not Christians, for those of you who are secular, what we're doing is we're just looking at the life of Paul, and we're looking at how he responded to certain things. Okay. So he says, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. Then he says, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measure. What is he talking about? He's talking about being flogged, being whipped, right? He says, there's nobody who has been whipped more than me. In prisons, more frequent. In deaths, oft. I mean, just literally within an inch of death, right? He's come so many times. He says, of the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes save one. Okay, let's think about that. 5 times he was whipped on his back 39 times. I'm not a mathematician, but that is far too many for me. As a matter of fact, one time of 40 stripes save one would have been enough for me. He went through it 5 times. He says, thrice I was beaten with rods. Doesn't sound fun. Once I was stoned. That really doesn't sound fun. Then he says, thrice I suffered shipwreck. I don't even like water above bathtub depth. And he was shipwrecked in the sea 3 times. That's a little crazy to me. A night and a day I have been in the deep. Not my cup of tea at all, right? There's like sharks and stuff, and a whole lot of stuff in the deep that I don't want any parts of. And this man had to be a night and a day in the deep. Doesn't sound fun. Um, he says, in journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and in painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold, in nakedness. Some of us can't even handle it when the heater goes out in our houses. This man went through something very, very difficult. And then he kind of continues on, but he says, hey, you know what, these things are just light afflictions. They're not a big deal, right? There are many of us who have had difficult lives, myself included, but not a one of us can say that we have had a life as difficult as Paul's. I have never met anybody whose life came anywhere near the level of difficulty that Paul has experienced. Okay. um and yet Paul said, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. Dr. Paul, therapist Paul, with his therapist hat on, was teaching us cognitive reframing. What he was saying is, hey, my life has been terrible. My life has been incredibly difficult. But I'm here to tell you that I have peace and that I am content because I learn how to cognitively reframe the negative experiences and pull the blessings out of them, pull the lesson out of them, pull the growth out of them, and understand that all these things were for my benefit. But we don't do that. We don't do that. We cry and we whine, and every time something difficult happens, oh, why me? Right? Life is so unfair. Well, let me let you in on a little hint. I've been here uh for 40 something years, and one thing that I know is never ever was there a promise that if you were alive on this earth, life would be fair, right? But what did Paul say in that same chapter in Philippians chapter 4? Later on, he says, not that I, in verse 11, not that I speak in respect of want, for I've learned that whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. He's saying, I am gotten so good at this cognitive reframing thing that it doesn't matter what the situation is, I can have peace. I was watching an interview with Kevin Durant and Draymond Green after the Olympics. Now, I am born and raised in San Francisco, California. I'm from the Bay Area, so I've been a Golden State Warriors fan my whole life, and so I was interested in this interview, and I watched it, and I heard Kevin Draymond Green asked Kevin Durant a happy question about him being happy, or searching for happiness or something to that effect. And Kevin Durant said something very poignant. He said, "I don't care about happiness. I don't go searching for happiness or chasing after happiness. Happiness is just a feeling. What I covet, what I look for is peace." Think about that for a second. Think about that for a second. How incredibly wise is that? You see, there are things in life that can make us happy for a moment, but they're incredibly unhealthy for us, right? How many times have people crossed our paths that just excited us like no one else ever before, but they made us miserable? And then we pass by somebody who may not make us as excited as this person, but they could give us peace because we're chasing happiness instead of looking after peace. How many times in life have you been happy, but the minute something difficult happens, somebody looks at you the wrong way, somebody says something about you, anything happens, your joy is gone just like that. But peace, ironically, you can't be happy, at a funeral. You can't be happy, after you got into a car accident. You people think you're crazy. You know, you can't be happy when you're terminally ill with cancer, right? People would think you're crazy, but you know what you can have during those times? You can have peace, right? At a funeral, you ever meet somebody and they've just lost a child or their spouse or something to that effect, and you see them sitting there with this beautiful sort of radiant sort of smile on their face, and you say, "Wow, you're so strong," and they just say, "I'm at peace," because they trust that everything's going to be okay. See, that's the thing. That's what Kevin Durant was talking about. He was saying, basically, I've chased happiness. I'm a multimillionaire. I'm one of the best basketball players on planet Earth. And what I realize at the end of the day is what matters most is peace. And peace comes when we follow the advice that therapist Paul, Dr. Paul, was giving us to cognitively reframe the way that we think, to guard our thoughts by cognitively reframing the experiences that we have in life. This is an article by Anne Morin, and it's from verywellmind.com, and the article is called "What is Cognitive Reframing?" It says cognitive reframing is a technique used to shift your mindset so you're able to look at a situation, person, relationship from a slightly different perspective. Now, how many of us, if we just stopped right there and we were just able to do that one thing, how many of us could experience more peace in life? Okay. Cognitive reframing is something that you can do at home anytime you experience distorted thinking, but it can be helpful to have a therapist's assistance, particularly if you're caught in a negative thought pattern. So, what a negative thought pattern is those same thoughts that replay on loop in your mind over and over, day and night. They don't even have the decency to go away when you sleep, right? You go to bed thinking about it, you wake up thinking about it. Somebody who has done something to you to harm you could die, and you still think about what they did to you. That's a negative thought pattern. And they're saying, you can try these techniques, but if it doesn't work, you may need a therapist assistant. Now, a lot of people in the secular world understand the value of therapy. In the Christian world, interestingly enough, we don't understand it as well, because most Christians will just say, "Oh, well, just pray about it," right? And I'm all for that, but when somebody is breaks their foot or their arm, you don't tell them just pray about it. You tell them let's pray over you, and then let's go to the doctor, right? So in the same way, when it comes to mental health, yes, absolutely, you pray about it, but then you go, and as Dr. Carlton Oler would say, you get a checkup from the neck up, right? It's very important that Christians not be resistant to therapy, because there are many wonderful Christian therapists out there who could help you discover things that could break chains and cycles in your life that could actually um, finally help you bridge the gap between you and God that's been there for so long. Um, Continues and says cognitive reframing is something that you can do at home or anytime you experience distorted thinking. When the technique is used in a therapeutic setting and practiced with the help of a therapist, it's known as cognitive restructuring. The essential idea behind reframing is that the frame through which a person views a situation determines their point of view. Okay, how do you guard your mind? You have to think about the frame through which you're viewing a particular person or situation, because that will determine how you feel about it. When that frame is shifted, the meaning changes, and thinking and behavior often changes along with it. I'll give you a perfect example. I once heard a pastor share a story. There was a man, he was on a bus and he had three children, and they were, rambunctious, and one was jumping around, and one was crying, and one was just irritable, and they were creating quite a bit of noise. And the man just kind of sat there looking a little lost and disinterested. And after, some time, an older gentleman sitting across got really angry and said to the man, "Can't you control your kids?" So what was he seeing? He was seeing a bunch of rowdy, unruly children, maybe undisciplined, and a man who seemed to have little interest in controlling his children and making sure that they behaved well and respected the people around them. That's what he saw from his point of view. Okay. Well, the man kind of looked up at him and he said, "I'm very sorry. We just came from the hospital and the children's mother had just passed away. And I'm just feeling a little lost right now." So all of a sudden, all of a sudden, this man who was reprimanding this father feels terrible, because now he's seeing the situation for what it is. He's seeing, instead of a disinterested father and a bunch of unruly, undisciplined kids, he's seeing a family that has just been devastated, as the matriarch of their family has gone to an early grave. And now these three children are lost, with their mother and probably primary caregiver no longer being there. They're going to have to grow up without a mother. And here is a father that is going to have to grow up without, raise these children without his wife, and he's feeling lost, and he's just a little dazed and confused. And the man is looking at the situation very differently, and he sits back and he calms down and he shuts his mouth. You see, by slightly changing the way that we look at situations, the frame through which we view a situation, it oftentimes will change the meaning, the way we think about the situation, and the behavior that we have in towards the situation. The article goes on to say, another way to understand the concept of reframing is to imagine looking through the frame of a camera lens. The pictures seen through the lens can be changed to a view that is closer or further away. Um, that's closer or further away. By slightly changing what is seen in the camera, the picture is both viewed and experienced differently. Um, and then it goes into techniques, right? It says reframing may be used to change the way people think, feel, behave. Here are a few examples of reframing, how reframing may be used in therapy. So he talks about, in a family therapy session, He says there was a woman named Carla who complained bitterly that her mother is overly involved in her life, constantly nagging about what she should be doing. In attempting to shift Carla's negative view of her mother, the therapist offers the reframe. Well, isn't it loving of your mother to teach you ways to take care of yourself so that you'll be prepared to live on your own without her? Carla says, huh. You know, all of a sudden that thought helps her to think a little bit differently about the situation. Um, individual therapy, in individual therapy situations, there's a couple examples that she uses. She says a person in individual therapy is struggling to accept the limitations of a chronic illness. And the therapist attempts to reframe how they view their illness by saying, can you think of your illness as a built-in reminder to take care of your health throughout your life? Wow, never thought about it like that. I guess you're right. I'm going to eat right, I'm going to exercise, and I'm really going to take care of my health so that it doesn't get worse. Wow. You know, I know some people that were diagnosed with chronic illnesses and ended up living very, very healthy lives because of the way that they took care of themselves after their diagnosis. In fact, they became healthier after the diagnosis of a chronic illness than before. Um, Another one says a man that is upset that he wasn't chosen for a promotion. How many of us have been there, right? Somebody who came along after us, somebody who we felt didn't deserve it, didn't work as hard as us, wasn't as talented or as smart or whatever, gets a promotion instead of us, and we become very angry and very bitter. Um, the therapist asked him what positive things could come from not being promoted. And the man thinks about it and says, well, um, yeah, I guess, maybe if I had gotten that job, it would have came with some, unwanted additional stress. And that maybe, I might now be able to work towards another role that's better suited to my personal needs and my long-term career goals, right? So just thinking a little bit differently about the situation helped him. So it took away all that anger, all that frustration, all those feelings of being wronged, right? Um, Another example is a woman, is upset, really upset and angry about getting, a ticket for texting while driving. Those, cops, all they like to do is fill quotas. I can't believe this. And so her therapist then talks about the dangers of texting while driving. And after talking to her therapist, eventually she's able to see that that ticket might actually help sort of deter her from engaging in that kind of dangerous behavior in the future, right? So just by reframing those thoughts, we can become healthier and get into a better space. How do you guard your mind? You have to be really careful about what you think about and how you think about what you think about. Very important, right? Again, we look at the example of Paul. Paul said, I have learned that whatsoever state I am in, therewith to be content. Paul went through a lot. We looked at that. Dr. Paul went through a lot, but he learned the secret to peace. It was living a life full of gratitude, right? Not bearing all your burdens and carrying them with you every day. I know people that if you ask them, oh my goodness, it's hard to talk to some of these people sometimes because you ask them about their difficulties and they can just boom, 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 boom. I mean, just machine gun it, rapid fire. They can list off all the messed up things going on in their lives. But you ask them about the good things. Uh, um, well, yeah. Why is that? Why is it so easy for people to go, oh, this is wrong, 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 but you ask them what's right? I can't answer, right? Because their minds are so accustomed to thinking on negatives. But how did Paul find the peace that passes understanding? How did he find the ability to be happy, when he's living a life where he's, thrice shipwreck, in prison often, near the point of death often, stoned, beaten, all those things. How was he able to be content in those situations? How was he able to have peace in those situations? Because he reframed those situations. When he had the thorn in the flesh that he had to deal with his whole life, he reframed that situation as something that was good. Now, how come we can't do that? You know, whether you're a Christian or a secularist, you can make the choice to think about certain things in certain ways and to not think about certain things as well. You can make that choice. We have more power over our mental state than we actually think. And this is why we have to guard the mind. This is serious. This is serious, and this is not just for, the regular folk or the lay people, right? This is for people in powerful positions. This is for people in positions of leadership. This is for the pastors and things like that. Because just because you have a position of leadership in any particular situation, whether it's in government or business or in a religious institution, it doesn't mean that you're immune to this kind of negative, unhealthy thinking. And when you are leading people and you have this kind of negative, unhealthy thinking, you are the blind leading the blind. And I can tell you, because I can point to people that are leaders in business, people that are leaders in government, in the political realm, and people that are leaders in the religious realm that are simply the blind leading the blind. But you can't tell them nothing because they don't want to hear it, because they think they're right about everything. And that's the saddest part about the whole situation. Um, the article continues in it, and it talks about what can help, or what cognitive reframing can help with. Okay, so let's look at this. It's really interesting. The article says that cognitive restructuring can be used to treat a wide variety of conditions. Okay, so lay it on me. Sounds interesting, but I'm not sure that it's for me. Well, look at this. It says that cognitive restructuring or reframing can be used to treat addiction. I'll say, I don't have an addiction. I don't shoot heroin or smoke crack. Well, maybe you're addicted to food, right? I mean, that stomach didn't just come from nowhere, right? Maybe you're addicted to watching TV when you should be reading books and studying and doing things that are important. You're sitting there Netflix and chilling, right? Maybe you're addicted to video games or, God forbid, something worse on your computer. Um, so we all struggle with addiction in one form or another. The people who get the help and overcome it are the people who actually recognize and admit it. So you have to be willing to admit that, and cognitive reframing can help with that. Anxiety. This is not a problem that's limited to any one demographic in society. This is chronic, and it doesn't matter whether you are secular, whether you are religious. Anxiety is a big problem. How about chronic pain? So wait a minute. You're telling me, you're telling me that cognitive reframing can help with my chronic pain? How stupid is that? What does that have to do with anything? I'm, I have chronic arthritis, and you're telling me that me having happy thoughts or positive thoughts is gonna? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm telling you. That's exactly what I'm telling you. What many of us don't realize is that 9/10 of disease finds its origin in the mind. The body and the mind have a symbiotic relationship that you cannot separate. When one is off, the other will sympathize. For example, and you cannot argue this, when you feel incredibly sad, do you feel like getting up and dancing and jumping around and having a good time and going and working out? No, you just want to lay there and cry. Well, some people, not me, right? I don't do. I'm gonna force myself to go to the gym because I know ultimately it'll make me feel better. But most of us will do that, right? Um, when you feel angry, right? When you feel angry, how does your body feel? Your body responds to that. Your heart races, right? You feel drained, all right? It doesn't feel good physically when you're not feeling good here, okay? Um, how about when you're very sick? Do you feel happy? Like, I am so happy. The day is just going wonderfully. Everything is great, right? It's a little hard to do that if you're in the hospital with tubes coming out of weird places and you can't move, right? It's a little hard to be that happy, right? Because when you don't feel good physically, you're going to feel a little bit down mentally, even if you're the brightest person around, right? Because when the body is off, the mind will sympathize. When the mind is off, the body will sympathize. Okay. Now you stretch that out over a long period of time of being depressed and anxious and all these things, and guess what? All of a sudden, chronic disorders, chronic pains, and things like that start to appear. Chronic illnesses start to appear that doctors just can't figure out where they're coming from. They're coming from here because you weren't guarding your mind. And so now the mind has been, on this negative thought loop on repeat for days, for weeks, for months, for years, for decades in some cases. And now your body is finally breaking down in response to it. And how does that happen? Well, I talked about this in the past, but I'll repeat it just for the sake of what we're talking about today. And it's because uh, the body the body has self-healing mechanisms that shut down during a stress response. As a matter of fact, it's been said that one negative thought has the ability to, or negative emotion has the ability to shut down the immune system for up to 21 hours. Okay. Now, parse that out over decades and imagine what that does to the body, right? So are they're just restructuring the way we think can alleviate chronic pain, depression, right? Instead of being depressed about a situation, all of a sudden restructuring and reframing can help us change the way we think about something. Eating disorders, insomnia, pain disorders, post traumatic stress disorder. It's not just for war veterans, right? If you've been the victim of childhood sexual abuse, if you've been the victim of physical verbal abuse, if you've been the victim of an affair, you will suffer from PTSD. Well, cognitive restructuring can help with that. Um, and in addition to mental health conditions, cognitive restructuring has been found to help people cope with the following: caregiving, grief and loss, low self esteem, positivity, and relationship issues. So there's a lot of really valuable um, tools that we can gain and a lot of valuable benefits from cognitive reframing. Okay. Now, whether you practice it independently or with the help of a therapist, it really doesn't matter. It can be helpful because it can help turn problems or negative thoughts into opportunities for growth and for change. Who doesn't want that? Right. Um, I have a this book that I really like. It's called Steps to Christ, and it has a very interesting passage in it. It says, while I was working in the office, I received a letter from my friend who had been in grief and deep distress. She was asking for me for some words of encouragement. The night after I had read the letter, and I dreamed that I was in the garden, and one who seemed to be the owner of the garden was conducting me through its paths. I was gathering flowers and enjoying their fragrance when the friend who had been walking by my side called my attention to some unsightly thorns that were impeding the path. There he was, mourning and grieving. He was not walking in the pathway following the guide, but was walking among the fences and the thorns. The friend whispered, "Is it not a pity that this beautiful garden is spoiled with thorns?" The guide the guide said, "Let the thorns alone, for they will only wound you. Gather the roses, the lilies, and the pinks." And then the author asked, "Have there not been some bright spots in your experience? Have you not had some precious seasons where your heart throbbed with joy in response to the Spirit of God?" When you look back on the into the chapters of your life experience, do you not find some pleasant pages? Are not God's promises like fragrant flowers growing beside your path on every hand? Will you not let their beauty and sweetness fill your heart with joy? It is not what, listen to this. It is not wise to gather all the unpleasant recollections of a past life in its iniquities, disappointments, and talk over and mourn over them until we are overwhelmed with discouragement. A discouraged soul is filled with darkness, shutting out the light of God from his own soul and casting a shadow upon the pathway of others. All have trials, griefs hard to bear, temptations hard to resist. Do not tell your troubles to your fellow mortals, but carry everything to God in prayer. Make it a rule to never utter one word of doubt or discouragement. How do you do this? How do you do this? Well, you set your affections on higher things, right? You insist on elevating your thoughts to a higher plane. You're not going to worry about the lowly things of this earth, right? There's a in the Old Testament book of Isaiah chapter 40:31, it makes this interesting analogy. It says, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength, they shall mount up with eagles' wings. They shall run and not be weary, they shall walk and not be faint." And that's interesting. I love that analogy. What does that mean, they shall mount up with eagles' wings? Well, when you study the eagle, you know that whenever there is a serious storm, the eagle just keeps flying higher and higher and higher, and it just struggles to fly higher and higher until it pokes through those clouds and is flying above the storm. So during the storms of life, if we just elevate our mind to that higher planes, we can actually have peace that passes understanding, peace that most people can't comprehend. And we're going to get into this much more deeply in the subsequent talks about how to accomplish this. But one thing that I will say is one great way to guard your thoughts, besides cognitive reframing, is to do yourself a favor and turn off the news, especially the cable news like CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and all that junk. Okay. Because what you're looking at is pretty much pure propaganda. Okay. Um, in the book of Psalms 103 verse 3, it says, "I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes," or maybe not 103, but anyway, it says, "I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes." When you look at what's going on in the media, it's all about fear. It's all about propaganda. Fear-based news stories that prey on the anxieties that we all have to hold us hostage, right? Because it's all about ratings, and fear sells. As a matter of fact, a man, um, he said, "I once had a friend who grew up in China ask me why so many Americans watch the news. And confused, I asked, 'Well, what do you mean?' She responded, 'Well, in China, no one watches the news because we all know it's propaganda. I guess you Americans haven't figured that out yet.'" So, and then he says, "Among the moments that completely changed my paradigm on life, this was one of them." So, we'll get into this more. But when I say what you're watching on the news is probably unhealthy, there's a reason for that. And we'll get into this later in much more depth. But just by turning off the news, I mean, you can go and look for articles and try and gather research and information yourself. But just doing that one thing, there we go, Psalms 1013. Just by doing that one thing there, by turning off the news to guard your thoughts, by cognitive reframing, by choosing to focus on the positive rather than the negative, you can have a healthier mind and a healthier body as a result. So again, we'll get into this much more deeply in future talks, specifically talking about guarding our minds from outside unhealthy influences like the media, like the news, and things like that. I hope that you all enjoyed that talk. I hope that you learned a lot about the importance of cognitive reframing, and that you learned that the Apostle Paul apparently was a theologian and a therapist. So see you all later.